In 1985, 8-year-old Emily Pierce vanished during a small-town church bake sale without a trace. 12 years later, a man buys an old cookie tin at a garage sale and discovers a Polaroid of a terrified girl holding a handwritten sign with her name and the date of her disappearance, reigniting a long cold case and uncovering a hidden network of secrets, confinement, and survival that no one in the town was ready to face. The smell of warm lemon bars and cinnamon rolls drifted through the small fellowship hall of St. Bridget's Church, carried on the easy breeze of an April morning. The folding tables were covered with gingham cloths, rows of homemade pies and cookies set out like offerings to spring itself. It was 1985, and in the town of Maple Glen, the church bake sale was more than a fundraiser. It was a ritual, a gathering that marked the end of winter and the return of light. 8-year-old Emily Pierce stood on her tiptoes behind the table marked cakes, bars, proudly arranging a tray of her mother's lemon squares. Powdered sugar dusted her fingertips and clung to the sleeve of her yellow cardigan. She smiled at every passerby, beaming whenever someone took a second helping. Her mother, Helen, hovered nearby, accepting compliments with modest nods while keeping one eye on her daughter. Emily was the kind of child adults called sweet-tempered, polite to a fault, but filled with quiet curiosity. She loved old things, lace doilies, music boxes, cookie tins. That morning, she'd spent 10 minutes examining the church's dusty communion cupboard before Helen shooed her out. As more families arrived, the crowd thickened. Parishioners bustled about, balancing plates and punch, laughter rising like steam off the pavement. The air outside smelled of fresh-cut grass and blooming dogwood. Inside, it was sugar and chatter. "Emily, sweetheart," Helen called, her hands full of change and Tupperware lids. "Can you run to the pantry and grab the foil roll? We're almost out." Emily nodded eagerly and slipped through the side door, her sneakers squeaking against the tiled floor. It was the kind of errand a child had run 100 times before. Familiar halls, trusted walls. No one blinked when she didn't return right away. They assumed she'd gotten distracted, maybe stopped to pet one of the church cats or peeked into the choir loft. But 10 minutes passed, then 20. Helen checked the pantry. Empty. The choir loft. Nothing. The bathrooms. Locked. The church doors. Wide open. And by the time the first frantic shout rang out across the bake sale, the lemon bars had begun to melt under the sun, untouched and forgotten, just like Emily would soon be. At first, no one panicked. It was a church bake sale, after all. Kids ran off all the time, chasing one another, sneaking cookies, poking around the Sunday school rooms. But when Helen opened the pantry door and found it dark, silent, and the foil roll still on the top shelf, something in her chest shifted. Not panic, not yet, just a prickle. She called Emily's name once, then again, louder. Her voice echoed against the kitchen tile. No answer. She checked the hallway, then the choir loft, where Emily sometimes liked to sit and watch the organist practice. Empty. She asked Mrs. Tinsley by the punch bowl if she'd seen her. "Just a few minutes ago, maybe," the woman said, uncertain. Or maybe that was someone else? Helen's voice rose an octave as she asked others. A few parishioners joined in the search, checking classrooms, bathrooms, even the coat closet. But Emily was gone. Not hiding, not playing. Gone. The moment cracked wide open when Helen reached the back exit and saw the door ajar. A soft breeze stirred the edge of the doormat. Beyond it, the grassy field behind the church stretched out toward the trees. By then, 20 minutes had passed. Someone called the sheriff. Within the hour, uniformed deputies arrived and began canvassing the grounds. Helen sat on the front steps, pale and trembling, while her husband, Dan, stood motionless beside the lemonade stand, knuckles white around his wedding ring. Volunteers fanned out into the field with flashlights and strained voices, even as the afternoon sun still clung to the sky. They called Emily's name until it felt brittle and meaningless. Then, behind the old maintenance shed, A girl's sneaker was found. White canvas, streaked with grass, laces untied. Tucked inside was a pink ribbon, the one Helen had tied in Emily's hair that morning. It was the first and last item of hers anyone would recover. That night, floodlights lit up the church lawn. Dogs were brought in. Helicopters circled, but the field yielded nothing. The trees held their secrets. And by morning, Maple Glen wasn't the town with the best lemon bars anymore. It was the town where Emily Pierce disappeared. By sunrise, the Pierce home was surrounded, not by news vans or gawkers, those would come later, but by neighbors with coffee in hand and questions they were too afraid to voice. Volunteers gathered at the church parking lot, some still wearing aprons from the bake sale, others rubbing the sleep from their eyes. It didn't matter. Emily was missing. That was all anyone needed to know. Sheriff Clay Mercer stood at the center of it all, sleeves rolled up, radio clipped to his belt. He'd never handled a child abduction before. Maple Glen didn't have those kinds of stories. It had bake sales, potlucks, and 4th of July parades. Not search grids and missing posters. But Mercer was methodical. He set up base inside the church hall and mapped out every inch of the property. Officers began combing the woods behind the building in tight lines, voices calling into the trees. Cadaver dogs were brought in, though no one said the word aloud. It felt like betrayal to even think it. Helen Pierce refused to leave the search site. She clutched Emily's school photo in one hand and a paper cup of coffee in the other, though she never drank it. Dan paced in short, broken loops near the church steps, his mouth a straight line, his eyes red. They searched the entire building, attic to basement. Dusty hymnals, Sunday school crafts, even the crawl space beneath the stage. Nothing. No signs of struggle, no forced entry. Just that back door, swinging open onto an endless stretch of field. By midday, the news had reached neighboring counties. More deputies arrived. Helicopters traced circles in the sky. And always, that one unanswered question hung heavy over everything. How could a little girl vanish from a crowded church in broad daylight? Someone remembered a blue van parked near the back entrance. Another claimed they'd seen a man watching the bake sale from the cemetery fence. But the details were fuzzy, and memories shifted like fog. That evening, a group of teenagers found a trail of tiny footprints near the creek bed half a mile away, but they ended at the water's edge. And the water kept moving. So did the days. But Emily didn't come home. The house on Willow Street grew quieter by the day, like it was shrinking in on itself. At first, it buzzed with people, neighbors bringing casseroles they didn't expect the Pierces to eat, detectives asking the same questions in different ways, reporters camped at the curb with microphones and soft voices. But over time, the visitors thinned. The casseroles stopped coming, and the silence took over. Helen stopped sleeping in the bedroom she'd once shared with Dan. She took up residence on the living room couch where she could see the front door, just in case. She kept the porch light on through the night and never moved the pair of shoes Emily had kicked off by the coat rack that morning. They remained exactly as she'd left them, one upright, one on its side, laces tangled. Dan tried to return to work at the hardware store, but he barely lasted a week. He spent most of his time driving the same routes over and over, the back roads outside of town, the trail behind the church, the highway on, ramp heading west. He stopped shaving. Stopped speaking much at all, just nodded when people asked if there was any news, as if words no longer belonged to him. Beth, Emily's older sister, was only 12, but she learned quickly how to stay small. She stopped asking if they could go to the park, stopped asking if they could turn off the news. She ate cereal for dinner most nights, alone, and sometimes stood outside Emily's empty room just to remind herself it was real. The town held a vigil 3 weeks after Emily vanished. Candles were passed around and a song was sung. A pastor spoke about faith. Helen stood at the edge of the crowd, clutching Emily's favorite sweater to her chest. Dan didn't attend. He couldn't. He was home, watching the porch, waiting. By summer, the media had moved on. Other stories had taken Emily's place. But in Maple Glen, the church bells rang hollow, and the bake sale never returned. The Pierce family lived together, but not really. They moved through the house like ghosts, orbiting the memory of a girl who had simply stepped into the pantry and never came out. And none of them knew how to keep living with a door that would never close. By the time autumn painted Maple Glen in gold and rust, the flyers had started to fade. Rain smeared the ink, wind peeled the corners. A few still clung to telephone poles and storefront windows, but people stopped looking. They had already memorized the picture: Emily's school photo, her smile small and uncertain, the pink ribbon tied neatly in her hair. Sheriff Mercer kept the case open longer than protocol required. He reviewed every tip, no matter how strange. A psychic in Ohio claimed Emily had crossed a bridge of light. A man in Georgia insisted she'd been adopted by a traveling preacher. A trucker called in from Nebraska about a girl at a gas station who seemed too quiet. Each lead ended the same way, in disappointment. The reward money went unclaimed. The phones stopped ringing. The Pierce family withdrew further, one layer at a time. Dan stopped speaking to reporters. Helen stopped attending church. Beth started skipping school. The house turned inward, like a wound trying to scar over. By early 1986, the file labeled Emily Pierce was moved from the sheriff's desk to a cabinet in the back room. It wasn't closed, just quiet, like so many others. Some officers said it was like she vanished into air. Others weren't so poetic. "Somebody took her," Deputy Walsh muttered one night, pouring coffee into a paper cup. "We just didn't catch him in time." Even Mercer had started to believe it. There was no scene, no ransom, no pattern. The ribbon was the only clue, and even that could have fallen loose as she ran. If she ran, they didn't know. Time is the cruelest partner to a missing child case. It dulls the urgency, steals the daylight from every memory. New cases arrive, new families grieve. By the second anniversary, only a handful of people still asked about Emily. A few church members brought flowers to the pantry door where she was last seen. Helen watched them through the window but didn't go outside. Beth didn't want to talk about her sister anymore. Dan started sleeping in the basement. In the drawer beneath Mercer's desk, the case file remained, tidy, intact, waiting. And somewhere, far beyond the borders of that quiet town, the girl in the photo was still gone. But not forgotten, not entirely. It was the kind of item you pick up without thinking. A vintage cookie tin, dented at one corner, the kind with faded roses painted across the lid and a rusting edge that whispered of old kitchens and grandmothers long gone. Ray Carter bought it at a Saturday estate sale 2 towns over, bundled with a mismatched set of Pyrex bowls and a rust-speckled sifter. He wasn't much of a collector, just liked old things that felt like they belonged to someone. Back home, he unpacked the box on his kitchen table, sorting through the contents before tossing most of them into the donation pile. But the tin, something about it made him pause. It rattled faintly when he shook it. He opened the lid. Inside were yellowed cupcake liners, brittle as paper bark. At first, he thought it was empty otherwise, just the forgotten crumbs of someone's attic. But then he spotted something folded, pressed into the bottom crease. A child's pink ribbon, tied in a bow, stiff with age. Beneath that, a Polaroid, edges curled from time. The photo hit him like a blow. A little girl, big eyes, pale, frightened. She sat on a mattress in what looked like a basement or cellar, the light dim and yellow. She held a cardboard sign in her lap. Emily. April 1985. Ray stared at it for a long time, unsure if it was some sick joke or a piece of truth no one had meant to find. He flipped the photo over, blank. Then he looked at the ribbon again. He didn't know what made him connect the name to something deeper, older, but he pulled out his laptop and searched Emily, 1985. Missing. It took less than a minute. There she was. That same photo, younger and brighter. Emily Pierce, age 8. Missing from Maple Glen, Pennsylvania, last seen at a church bake sale. Ray felt the room shift under his feet. He picked up the phone. Within an hour, the local sheriff had the tin, the ribbon, the photo. And Emily's case, buried for 12 long years, began to stir from its sleep. Not with a scream, but with a whisper from the past, hidden in a box no one was supposed to open. Detective Paul Keller wasn't the type to be rattled. 20 years on the force had dulled his nerves, and he'd seen his share of hoaxes, staged photos, and family tragedies repackaged as urban legends. But when he slid the Polaroid out of the evidence bag and stared into the eyes of the girl holding the cardboard sign, something unsettled him. The photo was real. No digital printing, no signs of editing. The timestamp ink in the bottom corner, April 22, 1985, was consistent with the film used at the time. The cardboard sign read Emily, April 1985 in a shaky scrawl, likely a child's hand. And the pink ribbon matched the one Emily's mother had described in her original statement, right down to the tiny embroidered daisies stitched along the edges. What got to him most, though, was her expression. She wasn't just scared. She looked hollow, like she hadn't spoken in days, like she was waiting for something that wasn't going to come. Keller drove out to Maple Glen the next morning, tin in hand. The church looked almost exactly as it had in the crime scene photos from '85, though the paint was fresher and the hedges taller. The bake sale had become a quiet legend in the town, talked about rarely, remembered too well. Helen Pierce opened the door slowly when Keller knocked. Her hair was thinner now, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes remained sharp. When he showed her the photo, she didn't blink. "It's her," she said before he could ask. She reached out, fingertips brushing the plastic, but didn't take it. Instead, she asked quietly, "Where was it?" Keller told her. "The garage sale, the cookie tin, the estate." She closed her eyes. "Someone kept her. Someone watched her," she said, voice tight with rage and awe and grief all colliding. The tin offered no fingerprints, too much time, too much handling, but it had cracked something open. The photo had been taken after the day Emily vanished, which meant she hadn't died that day. She'd lived, at least for a while. Something wasn't right. This wasn't a random abduction. This was a secret kept just long enough to almost be forgotten. Almost. The file was heavier than Keller expected. It had sat untouched in the archives of the Maple Glen Police Department for nearly a decade, its tab faded, the name Emily Pierce barely legible in pencil. When he opened it, the scent of old paper and dust rose like a breath from a forgotten room. Inside were photographs of the church bake sale, grainy aerial maps, handwritten interviews in faded ink. The pink ribbon, recorded as the only recovered personal item, had once seemed like the final punctuation in a story that ended with silence. But now, with the Polaroid and the ribbon from the cookie tin sealed in fresh evidence bags, that story had been cracked wide open. The case officially reopened on April 10, 1997, almost exactly 12 years after Emily's disappearance. The announcement made local news that evening. There were no press conferences, no flashing lights, just a quiet segment on the nightly broadcast with Keller's voice beneath a photo of Emily. A recent discovery has led investigators to believe Emily Pierce may have survived beyond April of 1985. Helen watched it from her living room, the same one that had once been crowded with casserole dishes and reporters. She said nothing during the broadcast, only reached out to touch the screen when the photo of Emily appeared, older now, terrified, still alive in the dim light of a Polaroid camera. Beth was 24 and living in Philadelphia when she heard the news. She drove all night and arrived before dawn, parking in the church lot and staring at the pantry door for nearly an hour before going home. The town stirred cautiously. Some were hopeful. Others whispered the photo might be fake. But Keller didn't care about whispers. He wanted answers. He re-interviewed surviving officers, including Sheriff Mercer, now retired and living alone in a cabin upstate. "We missed something," Mercer admitted. "I always felt it. That day, something slipped right through us." Keller nodded. Because now it was clear. Emily hadn't vanished. She'd been taken. And someone had kept her long enough to photograph her, to stage it, to leave a trail, deliberate or not. The cold case wasn't cold anymore. It was waking up. The tin had passed through too many hands to trace cleanly, but Keller started with what he had, the address of the estate sale where Ray Carter bought it. A tidy brick house with white shutters and an overgrown backyard, nestled on a quiet street 2 towns over. The kind of house that looked ordinary from the outside, lawn trimmed, windows curtained, secrets sealed. The sale had been organized by a local company hired to liquidate the belongings of the late Charles Lamb, a retired machinist who died 6 months earlier. No children, no surviving spouse. Just a niece who signed the paperwork and didn't ask many questions. Keller found her easily, Marla Tisdale, 42, dental hygienist. She'd only met Charles a few times as a kid. Her mother, his sister, had cut ties years ago. When he died, Marla cleaned out the house and signed over everything to the estate sale crew. She never opened the tin, never looked through the cabinets. "He was a recluse," she said, flipping through old keys in a kitchen drawer. "Kept to himself, never wanted visitors." The house reflected that. The furniture was sparse, the walls bare. But the garage told a different story. It was locked when Keller arrived. Inside, it smelled of oil and rust and something older, dust baked into every surface. Boxes of tools, newspaper clippings from the 1980s, glass jars filled with nails and screws. One shelf held a collection of tins and lunchboxes, some empty, some stuffed with receipts, buttons, or nothing at all. Ordinary junk. Except this wasn't ordinary. Not anymore. Keller found a photograph in a drawer beneath the workbench, black and white, curling at the corners. It showed Charles as a young man standing beside someone else. A brother, maybe. The other man wore a dark suit and a strange expression, no name on the back. Just a year, 1963. Keller pocketed it. Back at the precinct, he requested Lamb's employment history, his phone records, anything to explain how a missing child's photo ended up in his garage. But the paper trail was thin, too thin. Still, he had a name, a house, and a cookie tin full of memory. Where it came from was now clear. The question now was why he had it at all. The shed sat at the far edge of Charles Lamb's property, half swallowed by ivy and years of neglect. From the back porch, it was barely visible through the tangled thicket of trees and brush that had crept in over time. No one from the estate sale had mentioned it. The niece hadn't even known it existed. Keller spotted it during a second walk-through, drawn by the glint of rusted metal beneath the green. It took him 20 minutes to cut through the overgrowth, and another 10 to pry open the corroded padlock hanging from the door. When it finally gave, the hinges screamed like something protesting after years of silence. Inside, it was dark and close. The smell hit first, mildew, rot, and the stale ghost of something heavier. The flashlight beam cut through the gloom and landed on a bare cot in the corner, its thin mattress torn at the edges. A child's blanket, faded with cartoon animals, lay folded at the foot. The walls were unfinished wood, but covered in small scratches. Not deep gouges, not claw marks, just shallow, repeated lines in places where someone's hands had been, some near the door, others along the windowless wall. Keller approached slowly and ran his fingers along them. Beside the cot was a small wooden stool and an overturned crate. On the crate sat a dusty box of crayons, hardened with age, and a stack of paper curled at the corners. Most of the drawings had faded beyond recognition, but one was still legible, a girl with long hair standing between 2 trees, her arms outstretched. Above her, a sun. Behind her, what might have been a church steeple. Keller turned in a slow circle, letting the beam of his flashlight sweep the room. No electricity, no plumbing. Just a space too carefully emptied to feel random. There were bolts on the inside of the door, and on the outside. Someone had used this shed to keep something, or someone, in. He radioed for backup. Forensics would go over every inch. DNA, fiber, soil. But in his gut, Keller already knew. Emily had been here. And someone had kept her long enough to give her crayons. Long enough for her to draw a world she could still remember, even after being hidden from it. The ledger was found behind the shed's rear wall, tucked inside a narrow compartment beneath the floorboards. Keller's team had pulled up the rotting plywood in search of evidence, hair strands, fibers, trace DNA, but what they found instead was a panel that didn't match the rest of the floor. It lifted easily, like it was meant to be opened. Inside was a small fireproof box, locked but rusted through. They pried it open. The notebook inside was thin, worn leather, the edges soft from handling. Its pages were yellowed, many stuck together from moisture, but the writing remained sharp. It wasn't a journal. It read like a log, dates, initials, short entries written in neat, deliberate handwriting. Some entries simply said delivery or milk plus bread. Others more cryptic, new bedding, EP, cried again, night only, no sun today. The earliest entry was April 21, 1985. EP arrived. Keller froze when he read it. The page beneath included a crude drawing, just 3 lines intersecting. A triangle atop a rectangle, labeled church. The date matched the day Emily vanished. He turned the pages slowly. The entries continued, sporadic, for 7 years. Mentions of burn on hand, quiet again, and once begged to go outside. There were no names beyond initials. But Keller's stomach tightened when he reached an entry from 1992. It simply read, E.P. left. Walked out before dawn. No trace. There were no entries after that. Keller handed the notebook to forensics with shaking fingers. He stepped outside the shed into the late afternoon light, breathing air that no longer felt fresh. This wasn't speculation anymore. This was fact. Emily Pierce had been alive well beyond 1985. Held in that shed, recorded, managed, like something to be tracked, not protected. And Charles Lamb had written it all down. The question now wasn't just where she had gone. It was who had helped him keep her, who brought her food, who covered his tracks, who else had known. Because no man buries a notebook behind a false wall unless he fears what happens if someone reads it. And Keller had just opened a story someone had worked very hard to keep buried. 2. Chapter 12. Family Revisited. Make it a maximum of 400 words. Do not include bullet points or chapter headings. Write in the same tone and style as the previous examples. The nickname had sounded innocent enough when Keller first heard it, the Candyman. A title, whispered with fondness by elderly parishioners, mentioned casually by those who remembered the old bake sale days. Marvin Lamb had been the man with the peppermint jar, always standing by the church doors after service, handing out candy with a soft smile and a gentle pat on the head. But now, the name curled in Keller's gut, like spoiled sugar. The deeper he dug, the more the pattern emerged. Marvin wasn't just a church helper, he was everywhere. Sunday school, vacation Bible school, potluck cleanups, the nursery roster. Always volunteering, always in the periphery. Too helpful, some said, but no one had ever raised alarm. This was a small town. People didn't question kindness. Until now. Keller found a faded church bulletin from April 1985. Marvin was listed under Children's Activity Coordinator for the bake sale. His assigned duty, keeping kids entertained between booths. It put him within 10 feet of Emily Pierce when she was last seen. He requested Marvin's personnel records from the church. There wasn't much, a few thank you notes, no background check, no home address, just a P.O. box on the edge of town. But tucked in one file was a faded photograph. Marvin, holding the infamous candy jar, kneeling beside a group of kids. And there, front row, off to the side, was Emily. She wasn't smiling. Keller circled her image with a pencil, then circled Marvin's. He stared at the photo until the room felt too quiet. Next, he tracked down a woman who had worked in the church office at the time. She remembered Marvin clearly. He was polite, she said, wringing her hands. But odd. Watched people when they weren't looking, and he always seemed to know which children were new to town. He paid attention like that. One moment stuck with her. A week before the bake sale, she'd caught Marvin standing alone in the hallway near the supply closet, the same one Emily was sent to that day. When she asked what he was doing, he smiled and said, "Just making sure everything's in place." She thought it was a joke. Now she wasn't so sure. Neither was Keller. Because Marvin hadn't just been there that day, he'd been waiting. The Lamb brothers weren't listed together in any obvious place. No shared properties, no emergency contacts, no next of kin declarations. But in a town like Maple Glen, paper trails ran quiet and deep, and Keller knew how to follow the seams. He started with death records. Charles Lamb's listed no siblings, but his birth certificate, pulled from county archives, told the truth. Parents, Thomas and Vera Lamb. Children, Charles, born 1943. Marvin, born 1947. Brothers, 4 years apart. Keller drove to the tax assessor's office and pulled property maps. Charles's home was 2 towns away, but the land had been purchased with cash in 1984, just 3 weeks before Emily disappeared. The buyer? Charles Lamb. The address used for correspondence? APO Box in Maple Glen. The same one listed on Marvin's old church paperwork. They had been connected all along. What unfolded next was a slow, sickening layering of timelines. Marvin, volunteering at the church, watching Emily. Charles, purchasing property in quiet preparation. A locked shed. A cookie tin. A photo no one was supposed to find. Marvin had taken her. That much was becoming clear. But he hadn't kept her. He'd delivered her. Keller returned to the shed, stood in that damp, airless space with the crayon drawings and the scratch marks on the walls. It wasn't the kind of place someone stumbled into. It was built for hiding. Built for keeping. And Charles, quiet, invisible Charles, had played his part without ever stepping foot into Maple Glen. But someone had helped. Someone had opened the back door, distracted the crowd, walked a trusting little girl into a hallway, and whispered comfort in her ear. Marvin had made sure everything was in place. And when it was, he handed her off to the one man no one would ever suspect, his brother, the loner no one remembered. Keller sat in his car for a long time after that, the engine off, the windows fogging slightly with breath. The Lamb brothers had orchestrated something far more deliberate than anyone imagined. A quiet handoff, a hidden room, a life stolen and boxed away like it belonged to someone else. And no one had seen it. Until now. Her name was Lucinda Brandt, though most people just called her Lucy. She was retired now, living in a small assisted living home outside of Reading, Pennsylvania. Keller found her through a single line in an old intake ledger from 1987, St. Luke's Urgent Care Clinic, nurse on duty, L. Brandt. The visit was undocumented in any formal report. No insurance filed, no patient name entered into the system. Just a line written in the clinic's internal shift log, young girl, burn on left hand, brought in by adult male, no form signed. Keller showed Lucy the photo of Marvin Lamb. She squinted, tilted her head, then nodded. "That's him," she said softly. He brought her in, didn't want to wait. Told us she burned herself on a stove, said she was clumsy, always grabbing what she shouldn't. She mimicked his voice, then paused. It was the way he looked at her, like she was a pet that misbehaved. Keller leaned forward. "Did she say her name?" "No, she didn't speak. Not one word. eyes too wide, silent the whole time. Lucy looked down at her hands. She kept rubbing the hem of her shirt, over and over, like she was trying to disappear. The clinic had no record because Marvin paid in cash and insisted it was just a scrape. He refused further treatment or referral. Lucy had wanted to report it, but her supervisor brushed it off. "Family matter," he'd said, "not our place." Lucy never forgot the girl. "She had a ribbon in her pocket," she whispered. "Pink. Looked like it had been there a long time." Keller handed her a copy of Emily's photo, the Polaroid from the tin. Lucy stared at it for several seconds. "That's her," she said, her voice unsteady. "Older, but that's the girl." It wasn't just confirmation. It was a window. Emily had been seen again, alive, injured, still in Marvin's custody 2 years after her disappearance. Keller walked out of the assisted living center into a pale winter sun. The wind was sharp, but it didn't touch him. The picture was almost complete now. She hadn't vanished into darkness. She'd been hidden in plain sight, passed through hands like a secret no one wanted to keep but no one dared to expose. And still, she hadn't spoken. It arrived in a paper envelope, creased and unmarked, hand-delivered by an aging landlord named Thomas Bell. He'd seen the story about Emily's case reopening in a local newspaper and recognized the name Charles Lamb. He'd once rented a duplex to him back in the early 90s, just for a few months. Said Charles was quiet, paid in cash, and never left the porch light on. A forgettable tenant, except for what he found years later. The envelope contained a single Polaroid, yellowed at the edges, the image dulled with time but still clear enough to stop Keller cold. A girl sat in a small room, cross-legged on a cot, her knees pulled to her chest. Her hair was longer now, unkempt, but her face unmistakable. Emily. Maybe 10 or 11. The same wide eyes, the same haunted quiet. And she was wearing the ribbon. The same pink one, still intact, still tied carefully in her hair like someone was trying to keep up the appearance of care. The background wasn't the shed this time. It looked more like a basement. Cinder-block walls, a dusty utility shelf in the corner, and a small desk lamp casting a circle of light around her like a stage. She wasn't holding a sign in this photo. She was holding a crayon. Keller flipped it over. Nothing on the back. Bell said he found it in the attic crawlspace after Charles moved out. "Forgot about it," he admitted. "Didn't know what it was until I saw her face in the paper. Been sitting in a drawer for years." The date on the photo border read August 1989. Keller took it to Helen Pierce first. She stared at it for what felt like an eternity. "She looks older," she whispered. "But it's her. That's Emily." Then, something more. Helen touched the edge of the photo, eyes narrowing. "Someone tied her hair that morning. Someone cared enough to do that, or wanted it to look like they cared." The photo was another crack in the wall. Another breath of proof that Emily hadn't just survived, but existed in stolen glimpses, carefully preserved, deliberately hidden. Not dead. Documented. As if someone needed to remember her when the world tried to forget. The report was buried deep in the original case file, misfiled under vehicle sightings with a handful of half-credible tips and wild guesses scrawled on carbon paper. Keller only found it because he asked for everything, every scribble, every intake sheet, even the files marked irrelevant. It was dated April 21, 1985, the day Emily vanished. A woman named Arlene Weller, who lived across from the church, had called the station at 2:12 p.m. She'd reported seeing a blue van parked just outside the rear entrance to St. Bridget's around the time the bake sale was at its busiest. "Didn't look like it belonged," the note read. "Engine running, man got out, tall, balding, wore dark clothes." The call was logged, but nothing followed. No officer was dispatched, no license plate noted, no follow-up interview. Keller read it twice, then slammed the folder shut. He went straight to the retired dispatcher who'd been on duty that day. A man named Pete Donovan, now in his 70s, mostly deaf but still sharp. "Yeah, I remember the call," Donovan said. "Told Mercer about it. He said someone else was already checking the church lot and to file it with the rest." "Did anyone look for the van?" Keller asked. Pete just shook his head. "Too many cars that day. No one thought it was a lead. Thought the girl just wandered off." Keller tracked down Arlene Weller. She still lived in the same house, now mostly cared for by her daughter. She was older, frailer, but when he showed her a photo of Marvin Lamb, she stared hard at it. "I think that's him," she said. "That's the man I saw." "And the van?" "Blue. Boxy. Parked where no one could see it from the front lot." It took Keller only an hour to confirm what had been missed all those years ago. DMV records showed that Marvin Lamb had registered a blue Ford Econoline van in March of 1985, sold it 2 years later. Never mentioned in the original investigation. A window had opened that day. A lead left to rot in a drawer. Emily hadn't disappeared without a trace. The trace had just been ignored. The last known address for Marvin Lamb was a rusted trailer tucked into the woods off Route 53, a forgotten patch of land outside of Delbrook. County records listed it as unoccupied since 1992, but Keller knew better than to trust official timelines in cases like this. He found it just past a gravel turnoff choked with weeds, the mailbox long gone, its post leaning like a tired man. The trailer itself was sun-bleached and dented, the front steps half collapsed, windows caked with grime. A faded wind chime hung crookedly from the awning, clinking in the breeze like an afterthought. Keller pushed open the door. It creaked in protest but gave way. Inside, the air was stale with rot and rust. Mold clung to the corners. Old newspapers covered the floor. Duct-taped furniture sagged under layers of dust. But what drew Keller's eye was the back room, what had once been a bedroom. The walls were painted a pale yellow, different from the rest of the trailer. There were stickers peeling off the door, butterflies, stars. And there, beneath the dust, was a twin-bed frame. No mattress, just the frame, and bolted into the inside of the door, from the outside, was a latch. Forensics would later find evidence: tiny hairs in the carpet, long and light brown, scratches in the wood along the window ledge, a small drawing tucked under the closet panel, nearly disintegrated, of 2 stick figures holding hands beside what looked like a church. Keller spoke to the neighbors, few as they were. Most had moved in after the early 90s. But one man, Amos Richter, remembered Marvin. "Lived there alone, far as we could tell," Amos said. "But every now and then you'd see a kid. Girl, maybe 10, pale, never spoke. Always came out late, like dusk. Quick trips to the car, never to play." "Did anyone ever ask questions?" Keller asked. Amos shook his head. "Didn't seem right to. You know how it was. Keep to your own." That silence had lasted years. But it couldn't anymore. The trailer may have been abandoned, but its walls still whispered. Emily had been there. And at some point, just like before, she had slipped away. The DNA came from a piece of torn fabric found wedged deep behind the closet panel in the trailer. It was pink, faded almost white, with a bit of stitching that looked hand-repaired, 2 tiny X's done in blue thread. Keller didn't notice it at first. A tech flagged it during the final sweep, sealed it in a sterile envelope, and labeled it "Potential Biological Evidence, Textile Fragment, Room C." They didn't expect much, too much time, too much exposure, but Keller sent it in anyway. When the lab called 10 days later, he answered on the first ring. "It's a match," the technician said. "Mitochondrial DNA confirms a direct maternal link to Helen Pierce." For a moment, Keller couldn't speak. The silence on the line stretched long enough that the tech added, "We ran it twice to be sure." It was proof. Scientific, indisputable proof. Emily had been in that trailer, not just possibly, not just maybe, absolutely. Keller drove to Maple Glen that evening. The sun was setting as he pulled into the Pierce driveway. The porch light clicked on automatically, just as it always had since Emily vanished. Helen opened the door before he could knock. She didn't ask why he was there, she only looked at the envelope in his hand. He didn't try to soften it. "They found a piece of fabric," he said. "A shirt, we think. It tested positive. It's hers." Helen pressed a hand to her mouth. Her knees buckled slightly, but she didn't fall. She leaned against the doorframe and nodded. "I knew," she whispered. "I always knew she was somewhere. I just didn't know where." Keller sat with her in the living room as the sky darkened. The house was quiet. On the mantel was a photo of Emily in second grade, the same one they'd used in the missing posters. And beside it, the pink ribbon, now framed. "We're closer," he said. "She lived. We know that now." Helen didn't cry. She just whispered, then she had hope at least. She had time. Time was all they'd wanted for her. Time to survive, to grow, to run. And now they knew she had taken it. They found him living under the name George Langley in a dilapidated trailer park outside of Altoona. The utilities were barely on, and the rent was paid in cash. He was older now, gaunt, eyes sunken deep into a face that once wore the guise of trust. Marvin Lamb had disappeared from Maple Glen not long after 1992, and for nearly 5 years no one had bothered to look for him. Until now. Detective Keller arrived just after sunrise. He didn't bring backup, just a file folder, a Polaroid, and a name that had been waiting for a reckoning. Marvin answered the door in a stained robe, his expression vacant at first, then wary. "What do you want?" Keller didn't ask permission. He stepped inside, let the door creak shut behind him. "I'm here about Emily Pierce," he said. Marvin froze. He didn't speak, not at first. Just stood there, hands trembling slightly at his sides. Keller opened the folder. He laid the Polaroid on the table, the second one, the girl with the crayon, the look in her eyes still heavy with time. "She was in the trailer," Keller said. "We have DNA. We have your name. We have your van in the church lot. You don't have to talk, but you're going to listen." Marvin sank into the nearest chair, like the weight of it all had finally caught up. "I didn't hurt her," he said at last, voice dry, cracking. "Not like people think." "Where is she?" Keller asked. "I don't know." A pause. "She left. She just left." "When?" "Spring. 92. She waited until I fell asleep. Slipped out the window. Never came back." Keller didn't blink. "Why take her in the first place?" Marvin looked down at his hands, fingers stained yellow from years of smoking. "She was supposed to go to Charles. I was just supposed to watch her for a day. Keep her quiet. But then, she didn't want to go. She cried. She held my wrist." "And you kept her?" He nodded. "She stopped talking after a while, drew a lot. I gave her books. She never asked to leave." "She was 8, Keller said coldly. "She didn't have to ask." There was nothing left to protect. No lies left that could shield him. And in the end, he didn't fight. He just whispered, "She got away." And this time, it was the truth. The question hung heavier than any evidence could resolve. Did she make it? The confession gave them a timeline, spring of 1992. Marvin claimed she slipped out through the trailer window and never returned. But there were no missing persons reports that matched her description. No Jane Does. No sightings. Just silence. Keller combed through every hospital intake within a 200-mile radius from that season. Burn units, ER visits, walk-ins with no identification, a few false alarms, but nothing that stuck. No one named Emily. No one matching her face. He started searching for aliases, for school records with girls who appeared out of nowhere in 92, for social services notes about silent, skittish children with no past. Still, nothing. But not nothing. Because buried in a foster agency log from upstate New York, a single line surfaced. Unaccompanied minor, female, approx. 14, found wandering near truck depot, refused to give name. Placed in short-term shelter, transferred June 1992. No photo, No fingerprint. Just a note that she liked to draw and didn't speak. Keller stared at it for hours. The trail ended there. The shelter closed years ago. The records had been boxed and misplaced. But it was something. A flicker of possibility. He brought it to Helen. She didn't say much. She just took the copy of the note and ran her fingers over it slowly. "If it's her," she said. Then she found a way to keep living. Keller nodded but didn't speak. Because the truth was, they might never know. Not for sure. But the drawings she left behind, the second Polaroid, the pink ribbon, preserved like a fragment of faith. The fact that Marvin never reported her missing, never chased her down, never said a word, those things mattered. Emily had survived captivity. She had survived silence. And maybe, just maybe, she had walked far enough into the world to become someone else, someone free. That's what Helen clung to now, not the absence, but the chance, the idea that out there, somewhere, a woman walked with a ribbon tied in her hair and a past she'd locked away. And if she was alive, Keller knew one thing for certain. She didn't need to be found. She'd already saved herself. Time has a way of erasing things. Not all at once, but piece by piece, like water wearing down stone. Names fade from paper. Places are bulldozed. And memories, even the sharpest ones, start to blur at the edges. By the time Keller returned to the trail, nearly everything that once marked Emily's path was gone. The truck depot where the unnamed girl had appeared in 1992 was now a chain grocery store. The shelter she'd been placed in had closed in 1999 after a funding cut. Its records had been boxed, misplaced, then supposedly lost in a flood during a basement renovation. Keller spent a week tracking them down anyway. He found a partial index in an off-site warehouse, water-damaged and brittle, but the girl's intake file wasn't among them. He followed the last person still alive who had worked there, a woman named Patrice Lang, now living in New Jersey. She remembered a girl, quiet, unnamed, arrived in early summer. She wouldn't let anyone cut her hair, Patrice said, wouldn't speak, just stared, drew in the margins of her intake papers. Keller showed her Emily's Polaroid. Patrice stared for a long moment. "It could be," she whispered. "I think it might be, but I can't swear to it." He thanked her. Not because it gave him certainty, but because it gave him something better, continuity. The trail was faint now, too faint to follow in the traditional sense. No address, no adopted name, just shadows that suggested Emily had walked forward without looking back. He visited the old church again, stood by the pantry door one last time. The paint had been redone. New doorknob. The corridor was brighter now, safe. But standing there, he could still feel the weight of what had happened in that silence, the decision that changed everything, made by a child who trusted the wrong hand. Keller didn't need the last piece to close the case. Sometimes, the absence was the ending. She was never buried, never claimed, never identified in a morgue. That alone was its own kind of miracle. Somewhere, her name had been traded for another. And maybe that's exactly how she wanted it. It arrived without warning, no return address, no postage, just a small cardboard box left neatly on Helen Pierce's front porch on a rainy morning in late April. The cardboard was damp but intact, sealed with a single strip of brown packing tape. Helen found it when she opened the door to retrieve the paper. At first, she thought it might have been misdelivered. But then she saw the handwriting on the label. Just 3 words, written in careful block letters. For Helen Pierce. Her hands trembled as she carried it inside. She didn't call the police. Not yet. She sat at the kitchen table, rain ticking against the windows, and cut the tape with a butter knife. Inside was a smaller tin box, matte silver, with scratches along the lid and a faint dent in one corner. It wasn't familiar, not like the cookie tin from years before. This one looked newer, or at least less worn. She opened it slowly. Inside were 3 things. The first was a folded note. No greeting, no signature. Just one sentence, written in handwriting that was shaky but unmistakably adult. I remember the lemon bars. The second was a photograph. Not a Polaroid this time, a standard 4x6 print, faded only at the edges. It showed a girl, maybe 20, standing near a lake at sunset. Her back was to the camera, hair long, tied with a pink ribbon. The image was slightly out of focus, but Helen's breath caught in her throat all the same. She didn't need to see the face. She knew. The third item was the ribbon itself. Old, delicate, embroidered with tiny white daisies, the one she'd sewn by hand for Emily the week before the bake sale. Time had frayed the ends, but it was still tied in the same loop she'd taught her daughter years ago. Helen pressed it to her lips, eyes stinging. She didn't cry. She smiled. Because it wasn't just a ribbon, it wasn't just a photograph, it was proof of life, of survival, of love, carried across time and silence and distance too wide to measure. Emily hadn't come home, but she had remembered. And somehow, that was enough. The envelope arrived 2 weeks after the box, slipped inside Keller's interoffice mail without a sender or stamp. It was thin, just one page, folded once, sealed with a single piece of transparent tape. The handwriting on the outside was the same as before, block letters, deliberate, unshaking now. For Detective Keller. He unfolded it at his desk. The paper was lined, torn from a notebook. At the top, a date, May 3, 1997. Below that, in black ink, "You were right to look. I lived. Not the life they wanted, not the one I was born into, but something that became my own. I escaped the night he left the window unlocked. I walked for miles. I watched people from a distance. I learned silence first, then slowly, how to speak again, how to be invisible. I never said my name, not until I was sure no one would use it to send me back. But I kept the ribbon." The letter ended there. No signature, no return address, just those words. Keller sat back, heart thudding. He read the letter again, slower this time. The tone was unmistakable. It wasn't the language of a hoax or a scam. It was quiet, controlled. The voice of someone who had survived a storm and learned to breathe again. He had the handwriting compared to Emily's school assignments from second grade. The loops, the spacing, different now, matured, but the slant remained. The habit of crossing T's low, a curved tail on the Y. It was her. There would be no press release, no grand reveal. Keller kept the letter in a separate file, one not entered into public record, per her unspoken request. Because Emily didn't want to be found. She wanted to be known. She wanted someone to know the truth, that she had survived, that she had lived. And now, she had given that to them. Helen framed the letter and placed it beside the photograph, the ribbon carefully displayed beneath them both. She didn't say much after that, just kept the porch light on every night like she always had. Not waiting anymore, but welcoming, just in case. Because Emily had chosen the world on her own terms. And the final proof wasn't the letter. It was her silence ending.